everyone. This is Valerie Szybala, the Executive Director of the Syria Institute, and I am coming to you live today for our third installment of our video Q&A series. Today we're going to be talking about safe zones, and this is a question that came from Andrea Brandanova. Thank you very much, Andrea. Actually, give me a second. Let's tag her in the comments right now, so she can watch if she's online. So Andrea's question was, why are so many, including the UN, opposed to safe zones in Syria, especially in the North Kurdish part of the country? So safe zones sound like a simple and clear win situation, but actually incredibly complex. And I welcome any experts, anyone with more knowledge than I have, to chime in the comment section down below after this video if they have anything to add that I might have missed, because it's a very multifaceted issue. So safe zones in Syria have been alternatively called no-fly zones, no bombing zones, humanitarian buffers, no-kill zones, ISIS-free zones, all these different names for a series of concepts that are all related, which is to create something in Syria where people can go to be safer from the bombing, to be safe from the violence. And this could be one area, it could be several areas. So we'll talk a little bit about what the safe zone would look like. But there are a lot of reasons why actors, including the United Nations, the UNHCR, the High Commissioner on Refugees, has come out against safe zones in Syria. The UN Secretary General has been skeptical, and human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch have come out against them. There has been some support from different countries. Turkey has been proposing a version of this for years. Some EU countries, including France and Germany, have brought it to the table from time to time. The US, under our previous administration, was absolutely opposed to it. Our current administration, our president, has thrown out the idea several times. So I think the first thing to understand about safe zones as a historical concept, and one of the reasons that you'll see groups like the United Nations or different agencies being opposed to it, is that they have a pretty troubled history of not being all that safe. And I could give you a list of examples I have here, but really the biggest example, and the one that I think has left the most scars on the international community, was the Srebrenica massacre, where in what was supposed to be a safe zone protected by a UN protection force, and turned out not to be safe, and 8,000 Muslim men and boys primarily were slaughtered. So that, as you can imagine, has left a scar and a stain on the concept of safe zones. It's also made international agencies incredibly cautious, although since then there have been more attempts to set up some sort of UN protected or approved safe zone. In Sri Lanka in 2009, did not work out so well. In Iraq as well, there have been attempts at safe zones that have had varying degrees of failure. So if you want to look at precedent, safe zones don't actually keep people that safe because of the way that they've been implemented. So one of the reasons a lot of actors, including the US, I think, have been really against or not willing to put any efforts into building a safe zone in Syria is that if you take responsibility for a safe zone, you're responsible for the safety of the people inside of it, and that's not always easy to guarantee. So the actual practical part of a safe zone means, if, for example, you want it to be safe from all forms of military violence, that means protecting both the land, so borders of the safe zone. That means putting in armed forces, and that would mean, if the US were going to do it, a pretty large deployment of US soldiers in Syria, and it's something that I don't think at least our previous government was open to, and maybe wouldn't have a lot of support among the general public. It also means being willing to enforce an aerial safe zone, which I think there's fear that at this point that could lead to war with Russia because Russia is very active in these skies. But it would also it would mean that you would have to be willing to take the risk to shoot down Syrian or Russian aircraft if they violated the safe zone. So that's one big challenge is the idea that it needs to be enforced, and so you have to have actors that are willing, have 100% buy-in, and have the arms, the money, and the political will to take the risks associated with protecting a safe zone. Safe zones can become targets on the ground, especially if they're not wanted by all the parties. So you could actually become a magnet for jihadi groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, also by the Syrian government if there wasn't buy-in. So putting forces on the ground to enforce a safe zone risks being drawn into a larger war if you're willing to enforce it. And if you're not, it's not safe. So that also entails a long-term cost burden to maintain that zone as a safe zone, because once you bring people into it, they're your responsibility. That leads into another larger issue with safe zones, which is I guess you could say, legality. In international law, if really, in this way, Russia is actually correct in their caution about a safe zone. They've said that they've been willing to support it, along with some other countries like Egypt and Lebanon, as long as it's coordinated with the Syrian government. And that would, because of the sovereignty of Syria, would make it internationally illegal. Doing it without the consent of the government in power would be pretty questionable. But that would also, in this case, make the zone much less safe, because the main military actor in Syria and the biggest military concern of, I'd say, the majority of Syrians is the bombing conducted by the Syrian government. So the idea that they would approve of a safe zone inherently means it's probably not keeping people that safe, because they're the people, they're the perpetrator of a lot of the attacks. If you were going to stick to international law and maybe go and get UN resolution, Russia would block it. They've shown the willingness to do that time and again, unless it were under their terms. So you have a bit of a catch-22 there. And then in Syria, I think there's another issue that make it maybe a non-starter for some countries, including our previous administration, including UN agencies, and that is the complexity of Syria and the competing interests mean that you have a lot of actors that would be trying to use safe zones for, which are supposed to be a humanitarian initiative, but they'd be using them for political and strategic ends, and it's not easy to see a way around that. Andrea specifically asked about in the north, in the Kurds. That's actually really controversial for Turkey, who borders Syria in the north and believes that the Kurdish YPG, and there's evidence to suggest that this is true, is connected to the PKK, which is considered a terrorist group by the UN, by the US and by Turkey. And they are really uncomfortable with the idea of the Kurds having control of a safe zone, because they see that as one step towards Kurdish autonomy, or the Kurds setting up their own state. And honestly, the Kurds may see it that way too. And there are a lot of Syrians in the opposition and also in the government who are not keen on having the Kurds entrench their power, because they see it as a risk to the breakup of the country. So it's actually quite tricky to maybe select an area that wouldn't have any political ramifications of this sort, that wouldn't be used by some actor in some way to further their own political means. The other issue with that, and one of the big reasons that a group like Human Rights Watch might be opposed to safe zones, is that countries might see it, particularly countries like Turkey or EU countries that have taken in a lot of refugees, might see it as a place to repatriate or dump refugees. Forcibly returning people to a country at war is actually a violation of international law, people have a right to seek asylum, and returning people to a safe zone that is not safe could actually be sending them into a death trap. But I think one reason that countries like Germany might be interested in the safe zone is because they see it as a way to potentially lessen their refugee burden. We did see that there is precedent for this being an issue when there were safe zones set up in the 90s in northern Iraq. Turkey blocked the border. So people were not given the right to seek asylum in a zone that didn't have humanitarian supplies going in and really wasn't that safe. So there are a lot of confusing and conflicting and complex issues with safe zones that might lead a lot of actors like UN agencies or the UN to be against them. It's not that the concept cannot work or whatever you want the concept to be. There are a lot of different permutations. But I think that in order to work, you would need to have clear goals as to who you're protecting people from. Is it ISIS? Is it the Syrian government? How are you going to enforce it? What actors are going to contribute, forces, arms, funding, and for how long to support the safe zone? It requires 100% political will and military and financial commitment to make a safe zone safe. And unfortunately, that's not something that we've seen in Syria. And this is not just Syria where this is a problem for safe zones, but certainly in Syria, the risks seem high for any actor that would be involved. And we haven't yet seen many actors willing to take big risks. So we will try and include some resources if people are interested in maybe the international law aspect of safe zones. We can include those in the comment section below. And keep your questions coming. Thanks, everyone.